Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, Tom.
I'm excited too. I'm excited too. You and I have spoken a lot
Yeah,
off the show, off the podcast, off the camera. Colleagues and friends, but I've never really dived into your mind and reading about your dissertation. I know you had a PhD. I know you got a background in academia. I'm
yes,
just pumped to get to know more about who you are and what you do, but also sort of how the research informs how you see the world. So many questions for me to ask you.
yes. I'm excited. I'm excited. Let's get into it.
I love it. I love it. Well, for everyone that hasn't come across your work, could you just give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to the research, somehow life always brings me back to creativity and collaboration and everything artsy. And so, my PhD was very much based on understanding more about what happens when we collaborate and what would that look like in a conflict space. Is there something in collaboration with art and with flow and with facilitating flow that could somehow, facilitate peace, especially at a time where intergroup conflict seems to
Mm,
be, it's just on the news every second. So that was kind of, I guess, what led me down that path to seeing kind of if there was anything here. And that led me to being a professor for about 10 years in psychology and creativity. And now I kind of take that whole mindset of um, identity and creativity and bring it into this role that I have now of coaching men. So
mm,
everything connects, which is fascinating.
yes.
But I love it.
It's
Yeah.
so interesting because there's so many different domains, or approaches here, and I love. I mean, it's almost a creative art form in itself. If we think
Yes.
about creative is, drawing wide associations to bring it together. That is almost your dissertation in any
Yes.
way.
Yes. Yes. It's amazing. Like I couldn't plan it out, but I just love the way that creativity interconnects with everything and can be used as a modality in
Mm,
almost any circumstance.
right.
That's one of the reasons I love it so much.
So there are therapeutic components to creativity as well, but I want to break down some of these ideas that you studied. So you've
Mhm.
got um, flow
Yes.
as a means to bring about greater social cohesion between groups.
Yes. Yes. So the fascinating thing about flow, and I'm sure you know all about this, we've talked a little bit about your interest in flow and creativity as well, but flow is being so immersed in something that you forget about everything else, right? Time stops, but there's also an element of enjoyment in there as well. So my whole thesis was based on this idea of if we can facilitate group flow, meaning there's a bunch of us experiencing flow together, would we then be able to facilitate um, peace, just
Mm,
feelings of peace? And the interesting thing about that and collaboration is, regardless of what you're doing before, when you and a group of people are now focused on an activity, your identity becomes the group identity, right? And then all of a sudden, this is the focus, nothing else matters. And even for a moment, you're not thinking about what identity you held prior to being in that space. So it's
mm.
pretty cool.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, you can see this playing out in the political world where, I mean, I suppose in America, pre 9/11, it wasn't as, shall we say, sort of culturally at odds. This like the culture wasn't as bad as it was then, but when 9/11 happened, there was a giant amount of cohesion that formed in response to the
Yes.
othering of the people that did them harm,
Yeah.
right? Of Al Qaeda. So you can sort of see how this works, where flow as this so and please jump in if I'm wrong here. It's like
Yes.
an activity or something that is designed to get you from where you are to where you want to be. And there's a linear relationship between progress and degree of difficulty. So you feel that you are moving forward in some way. So there is a
Yes.
goal derivative
Yes.
associated with flow.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
And what does that look like from the artistic standpoint? So you bring these two groups together and create
Yeah.
something? Or?
So
Mm,
the interesting thing is because of my affinity and love for art, I just felt like an artistic setting would facilitate flow more. But I did a study where I did an artistic piece of work versus just a normal activity. It was like a camping, what would you do if you were stranded activity. And there was no difference in flow. So what that told me was it really doesn't matter what the activity is, as long as the elements of flow are present, meaning same thing that you said, balance between difficulty and challenge and being able to focus and having a goal. As long as all of those are present and you get into the flow state, it doesn't matter what the activity is. Um, so that was really interesting, but also very exciting for me because in the scope of intergroup conflict, then it wouldn't matter what the activity is if you could just get these separate identities to focus on one thing that they both enjoy. That's a little challenging, but just get them to do it and just watch their identity switch. And then
mm.
all that matters is what's happening in that moment, right?
And there's a describe, if you may,
Mhm.
the feeling of flow to people that don't necessarily have a framework for it. Because I know
Yeah.
they would probably have accessed it, but they don't know what it is, right?
Yes. Yes. So it's when you're one of the examples I like to give is, imagine you're a writer and you just start writing and writing and the ideas are flowing and before you know it, you check your watch and 3 hours have gone by and you didn't even realize so much time had passed. You were in flow while you were writing, right? Some people get in flow when they're at the gym. Some people, when they're artistic, I would even argue binge watching on Netflix, right? You don't even realize hours and hours have gone and you're doing the same thing. So it's just almost a state of complete concentration that brings you away from the external world and very much focused in on what it is you're doing.
Right, right. And would you say there's a difference between flow as a sort of very conscious experience where you're aware that you're doing the thing, but you're also out of body as well. So it's almost like a just trying to flow through this myself here. It's like you're participating in the experience of being yourself, and that's fulfilling. Is it something like that?
Participating in being yourself. I think I would say yes. I believe there is an element of flow that could be associated with just merely existence.
Hmm.
Um, but the interesting thing, and I looked at this in my studies as well, is there's an element of loss of self consciousness. Right. So it's not necessarily self consciousness in the sense of being conscious of your surroundings, but you don't really care how you look. You don't really care what you're wearing. If your face looks funny, you're just like completely immersed in whatever is going on. Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Cool. So it's a loss of consciousness,
Yeah.
and it, but that's not being overly self conscious from like being very anxious or whatever it is. It's this beautiful
Exactly.
feeling of
Yes.
almost being
Yeah.
connected to the oneness, right?
Yes, the oneness is such a perfect way of putting it, being so connected to the activity, whatever it is, that other things just don't matter, even if it's just for that moment,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
I love
Yeah.
that. I'm sure you felt that when you were doing the dissertation because we all know how long that takes.
I wish I could get in flow when I was
Oh,
writing my
really? Okay.
dissertation. It was very, I would say it wasn't as enjoyable, the writing part. So maybe
Mhm.
that's why I couldn't get into flow. But it's again, flow is something that I think we get into every day at different periods of the day. So there's so many different spaces and places. I think I probably got into flow when I was just watching my participants interact with each other because it was just so fascinating to see them start out because we would give them a questionnaire and they would be on opposite ends of some kind of argument, right? So they'd come in heated, but then as we give them the activity and they start working through and their smile, all this stuff, it was just incredible to see them shift and walk out of the room feeling connected to each other. There's something
Mm.
really powerful that took place during that activity, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like you like almost creating peace, right, within that
Yes.
those two domains.
That was the title of my, well, the initial title of my thesis was going to be Creating Peace.
Oh, yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it is. So, okay, so let's dive in a little bit more now. So,
Yeah,
we've got two different groups. How are you choosing the groups? What are the differences? What are some of the conflicting points there?
yeah. So what we did was we gave them, at the time, I was doing it in England, and there was a lot of drama around, what do they call it? The exit,
Oh,
Brexit.
Brexit. Yes.
And there was, so many ideas of we should leave and we should stay. So I kind of gave questionnaires based on that.
Hmm.
And they would identify as leavers or people who want to stay. And it's so funny how just putting people who agree in a room and letting them know those guys in the other room disagree, just how they immediately start having these negative feelings towards
Mm.
the other group. It doesn't take much. And there are lots of studies that show that too, that just putting groups in a different color t-shirt is enough to get them upset, right? Um, so that was the criteria that we used. And then we would bring them in the room together. One group did an artistic piece of work, the other group did just a random something they'd have to collaborate with. And we would then give them a survey at the end and just see kind of how they were feeling. So my study, we did, it was both quant and qual. I
Hmm.
interviewed them after, and it was just amazing the themes that we got from that of peace and unity and, collaborative identity. Just I think the most powerful point in it for me, which is why I advocate about identity studies so much, is your identity can change it's so easy.
Yeah.
It's so easy. And the sad part about these intergroup conflicts is we take on this identity, but it's so fleeting because in a couple of days that identity won't matter.
Yeah.
So being able to bring flow into a setting where people are hot and just get them to focus on something else, I feel like could be so helpful, you know?
Me too. Me too. It's
Yeah.
interesting. There's so many different places we could go here, but one of the things I think is really popular at the moment among left-leaning academics is this idea of intersectionality, right? Where your identity is very much tied into marginalized aspects of yourself.
Yeah.
On the surface, that's a postmodern idea, right? On the
Yeah.
surface, that makes a lot of sense, right? We know that there are certain people with certain identities that have been oppressed and marginalized for hundreds of years,
Yes.
right? But then I also can't help but lean into what you're saying there as well, is that identity is also this very elusive thing that
Yeah.
changes and molds and grows over time. So
Yes.
how can we sort of, I suppose, from a therapeutic perspective, it's about having some sense of self, but also being very flexible with that sense of
Yes.
self.
Yes. Exactly that. I struggle with the thought of holding on to you know, this any kind of identity for just holding on to it so tightly that you don't allow any kind of growth, you don't allow any kind of
Mm.
change, you don't allow any kind of new knowledge or information because it is very fluid. It is very fluid, and so easily influenced by different things. When I'm teaching as a professor, the best example I like to give is sports fans, especially in England. If you are a football fan and there's a football game, you're wearing the garms, your face is marked up, you're hyped up for the day. everyone can tell whether you're a United or City fan, whatever. But the day after the game, if you walk out in that shirt, it doesn't mean as much. When you're at work, it doesn't mean as much. When you're feeding your kids, it doesn't mean as much
Mm,
because that identity doesn't matter in this space, right? So it's not about rejecting that you're a United fan, but you don't have to hold on to it so tightly because there's so much more that you are going to encompass as time goes on, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that that's so empowering as well, that there's so many more parts that make me me, not
Yes,
just this part.
yes,
You know,
yes,
this is a very strange thing. I was speaking about this yesterday in a group coaching call, and uh, my mind immediately went to Voldemort, how he diversifies his Horcruxes.
yes, yes,
You know? I mean, it's like, well, if I can sort of, diversify the
yes,
different parts of myself and me being the embodiment of all of that, then it's not such a, um, from a relationship perspective, it's not such a major transgression if you say I didn't take the bins out. Because I know
right,
there's other parts of me that's actually quite,
right.
quite nice.
Exactly, exactly. And it's allowing yourself the freedom to discover what those other parts could be, right? And I feel like as well in an age and era where, you know, I kind of call it the offended era where we kind
Mm,
of get offended about everything. If you don't hold on so tightly to this idea that this one identity is your entire being, it frees you up to not be so angry
yeah,
all the time because it's like, well, that's just one part. It doesn't matter what you think about that part. There's so many others, you
totally.
know?
It's actually good for you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think from my research and everything to do with flow, it's the identity part that gets me the most because when you're collaborating on anything, your identity sort of becomes about what you are collaborating, that the goal creates a new identity. And then the other stuff just doesn't matter. We see it all the time when I think you talked about 9/11, but we see it when there's crises, we see it when there are exciting things. People just come together because of this new thing that is now bringing them together. And then the other stuff, who cares?
Okay.
You know?
So So what happened in the research? I'd love to know. So we've got, generally speaking, conservatives and progressives on either side, for and against Brexit. They come together to work on a specific artistic project. And then what are they saying post research in the qualitative interviews about Brexit specifically, or the other, or their perspective of the other group's perspective, I suppose?
So it was interesting. I don't remember everything. It was a while back, but I do remember, um, especially when they were in the separate rooms, they would just they would hype each other up. So it was almost like yeah, like justifying each other. Of course, we believe this because XYZ and XYZ and blah blah blah. So there was a lot of in-group bias forming immediately, right? And then when they would come together in the room, you would feel the tension. You could almost feel it.
Mhm.
And I remember in one study in particular, they didn't talk about it. I just gave them the instruction. I said, okay, together, you guys are just going to create a piece of artwork together. Just draw something together. You get to decide. And it was so interesting. They drew exactly what they were feeling. Like they ended up drawing this traffic jam on a street, and it just looked so chaotic and so crazy.
Mm.
But when they got to the end of the drawing, they drew a picture of a globe and people holding hands together. So it was almost as if that activity the activity was them working through their differences
Yes.
until they came to this agreement that, you know what, it doesn't matter. We're all humans. We all love each other. Let's just be friends. So it was
Wow.
so fascinating to watch because they used the activity to work through whatever different it was, and they weren't speaking. They just did it through the artwork. Um, so that was one of the more memorable ones that I saw that was fascinating, and in the interviews, there was one quote I remember in particular where the gentleman said he walked in and he was a little bit nervous because he knew what the people in the other room were thinking and what they were, feeling. And he said, after we worked on this activity together, I felt like this guy was my brother,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And I remember that quote so well, and it just made me, I was so excited because it was proving what I wanted it to prove.
Yes.
But
Yes.
um, just really powerful stuff that these people were saying. And I think there's so much to tap into there that we could use presently.
Mm,
There's a lot of, I think, facilitation of conflict going on and not much facilitation of unity, but there's so much potential for that.
I mean, one of the things that comes to my mind very quickly is that it actually doesn't take long to bring about that unity. It's
Yeah.
almost like, I mean, some of the implications of these findings are isolation is really driving this wedge between differing viewpoints, right, all across the Western world. And
Yes.
even if we can just come together by, you know, participating in something as seemingly trivial as painting a picture,
Yes.
you're going to close that gap.
Yes. Yes. And I think that I see such a difference in the digital world versus, let's call it analog world. It's very easy to get caught up in that particular in identities online, super easy. But I'm realizing that there's a big difference when you kind of walk out into the real world where those identities kind of fade away when you're grocery shopping or when you're at the park or when you're at the beach and everyone's just enjoying the beach, right? Like
Mm.
the other day, I was at the beach actually, and some people were playing volleyball, and it's like, hey, you want to play? Nobody cares about any of these identities.
Yeah.
You want to play volleyball, you play volleyball, and you go home.
Mm.
So I feel like uh, I would say, Tom, it's easy to bring unity, but it's also equally as easy to facilitate uh, what do we want to call it, the conflict
Right.
as
Right.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. It's we're on the knife's edge, right? And
Yes,
like most of us, if not all of us, I mean, I've never really met someone that like, hey, I'm pro giant civil war. You, let's grab a coffee. I'm like,
exactly,
"Oh."
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I think, with just the way that the world is now and social media and I'm not even blaming social media. I just think that, you know, the 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 powers that be that kind of have the most influence sometimes just tend to seem to stir up the conflict a little bit more than trying to bring it together. But it's just as easy to bring people together.
Yeah.
It's just as easy, you know.
So, so perhaps let's segue this into how it applies to your work and our work, right? As
Yeah.
men's relationship coaches. So, what I've taken so far from this, Haley, is that for flow to ensue between two groups and then perhaps even between two individuals, both of those identities that are at odds with one another need to be
Yes.
subverted into a collective activity.
Yes. Yes.
What
That's right.
what is the activity? Maybe it's just communication itself, but are there ways that we can facilitate this interpersonal flow state when we're communicating with our loved ones?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things we talk about a lot in our work is just, you know, having fun, light moments, right? Taking your mind off the conflict. Don't bring up the rough stuff. Just fun, light, right? And it's in those moments that you are able to connect. Those are things you remember, right? And you're both doing something together that takes your mind off of the heaviness and the conflict. Another thing as it relates to identity, particularly in conflicts between couples, is you know the men that we coach sometimes they take on a particular identity and they place a particular identity on their partner. So she's not honest, or she's what's the one I get all the time? She's nagging, or
Right. She
she's
never apologizes.
she never apologizes, and she's vindictive, and all of these things. And so it's to challenge that and say, okay, what identity are you wearing that is causing you to see her in that way,
Beautiful.
right? And it just gives them the opportunity to challenge that and to change that. And when you operate from a perspective and identity of I love this woman, it's like, okay, how does she look now? And it's a different answer,
Yes. Yes.
you
And
know.
I can see how, so being a podcaster and someone that loves to talk, in case you can't tell, Haley, I I often feel this in conversations. I've felt it most of this conversation already, just to bring in the here and now, where my sense of self is lost as you and I are sort of dancing with different ideas here. And I think that's what's most beautiful about any variation of relationship, whether it's
Yes.
professional or platonic or friend or romantic, whatever it
Yes.
is that if we let go of identities, what you're saying, right? We're left open to the experience of the here and now, and God
Yes.
only knows what happens there. I know
Yes.
flow happens there, but it's exhilarating almost.
Yes. Yes. And it takes a little bit of, I wouldn't even say it takes a little bit of bravery. It's just an openness to releasing for even just a moment, right? And I feel I feel like there's, especially like in the space that we're in where we're coaching then, and we're dealing with, differences in couples and things like that. I feel like there's so much opportunity to challenge not only the present identity, but one of the things that comes into play as well is what are the things that you've taken on from your past? What are the
Mm,
things you've taken on as you were growing up that is coloring the way that you view your partner? And those things can be challenged and those things can be changed. They are not permanent unless you decide them to be. So
mm.
I really like the fact that I am able to encourage the challenging, but we talk a lot about things like, getting into the gym, getting your mind right, start reading stuff. All of these things are essentially engaging in activities that facilitate flow,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Okay.
And with the engaging in these things, your identity starts to shift. Oh, wait a minute. After you work out, I'm actually feeling good today, right? Wait a minute, I just read this book. Now I'm challenging the way that I think about myself. Wait a minute, I'm going to take a step back. I'm not going to be the angry man. I'm going to be the calm man. Now all of a sudden, the way that I show up is different because that's not the identity I'm choosing to take on anymore. So it's really opening yourself up to these experiences that can bring you into that space. And I would say inevitably start working on your identity, you know?
Lo and behold, why it's so scary though, because
Yes.
if you open yourself up to flow, you're saying, I'm willing to kill off some parts of me to become this other person.
Well, I don't know if I would say kill off, but if it's even for a moment, it's just recognizing how little it matters, right? It's like, like the example of the football game. You can be a man you find your whole life, but how much does it matter in different spaces? How much does it matter in general? Right? So it's just challenging these identities so that they're not crippling you. They're not bringing you to a place where you can't change. They're not bringing you to a place where you're fighting with your neighbor because you feel like if you don't uphold this identity, you know, like the world is going to end. When really, when we look at history, Tom, like all of these wars that have passed and come and gone are identities that have come and gone,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
It's kind of saddening to hear it put so simplistically, isn't it? Really, at
Yes,
the crux of every horrible thing that's ever happened, it's just someone and then a group of people and then a whole country of people and then
yes,
a group of countries
yep,
unwilling to have that flexibility of
yes,
identity.
yes. Yeah, and I don't know. I think that's something, when I was doing group studies, there are a lot of things that can fuel that hardness and that inflexibility, in group bias, fear, uh,
Mm, of
all
course.
sorts of things, but it can just as easily go. It can just as easily go without all the drama and trauma that comes with conflict,
Yeah, yeah,
you know?
definitely. Isn't it
Yeah.
so interesting that we see what plays out in the larger social world and even from a geopolitical perspective, the exact same things that are occurring in
Yeah.
relationships.
Yes.
It's like to your point there, right? Like you look at what happened to Germany after the First World War, where I remember the French president at the time, I think he was called the Tigre, or like that was his nickname, that he was like so vengeful that he was just going to absolutely punish the shit out of Germany. So their
Yes.
economy was ruined, and Nazism was sort of, in some way, a response to that and trying to build and bolster themselves up again, which to me is no different to kind of what you were alluding to before there, where it's like, say obviously we work with men, so like a man who's developed this sense of self, perhaps it's a very sort of I need to become the strongest, most powerful man, makes a ton of money, goes to the gym, all this sort of stuff, really in response to a horrible thing that occurred to him when he was a child.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And there comes, I feel like in everyone's life, there comes a point where it's challenged, right? And it feels so scary when your identity is never challenged until it is. And then you don't know what to do with yourself because
Mhm.
what happens now? If I'm not this, then
Mm.
what am I? Right? But life is so abundant, right? And you know, I'm sure if I was to ask you, Tom, if you're the same guy you were last year, you could highlight a number of changes.
What about yesterday?
Right? So I just I think as a human race we can give ourselves grace to evolve, to change our minds, change our identities. What you cared about yesterday, it's okay if you don't care about it today. Um, rather than kind of forcing ourselves to be fixed in these particular identities and held captive by these identities, with fear that if we let them go, then we're nothing or we're lost.
Right.
Whereas the perspective I like to hold is it's just opportunity to discover more of who you are, you know?
Mm, mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just two sides of the same coin, right? You can choose which
Yeah.
side's going to be actually
It
beneficial for
is.
you.
Yeah. It's all
Yeah.
perspective.
Mm, mm. I love
Mhm.
that, Haley. So, someone listening to this right now has heard of flow, perhaps has come across Mahali's work,
Yes.
and is hearing about how flow has a wonderfully therapeutic element to it, but also an interpersonally therapeutic element to it,
Yes.
but doesn't know how to access it for themselves. So,
Mm.
what does someone start doing in order to find more states of flow? I suppose.
That's a really good question. And, sometimes in my work, both as a professor, as a coach, I get asked, well, how do I even find myself, right? How do I find who I am, right? How do I discover my identity? Who am
Mm.
I?
Come on, Hailee, tell me.
I don't have the broader answer to that question, but what I do know is the way to start discovering it is to just start doing different things. Try something new, right? There are certain things that will never get me into flow, right? And but I wouldn't know unless I tried, right?
Nice.
And so I would just encourage, different activities. Go to a cooking class, go try surfing, go try swimming, go try talking to someone you wouldn't typically talk to. Put yourself in spaces that are uncomfortable, that are new, and give yourself an opportunity to evolve, to grow, to discover. Um, I remember the first time I did paddleboard yoga,
Oh,
right?
wow. Yeah.
And I'm not great at balancing. So I felt like this is crazy. What are you doing? But I absolutely loved it. And it was so incredible doing these poses with other people who I didn't know, but you feel a sense of connectivity in that moment when you're both doing the same thing. And I was lost in what I was doing. And I surprised myself that I could get lost because I thought it would be too challenging to get into flow, but it wasn't, right? So try something new.
Well,
Do
and I
it.
love. Sorry, Hailee, I just cut you off. I'm getting too excited myself here.
Okay. Go for it.
One of the
Yeah.
things I really like about what you just said there is that the like accessing flow is actually not that difficult. Like I think I've heard in the past people talk about flow in this sense of you have to have already cultivated enough of the skill to
Mhm.
then access that place, I suppose, where there is that linear relationship between progress and degree of difficulty. Because
Yes.
we know that if it's too challenging, it becomes anxiety provoking. So
Yes.
you become self conscious.
That's
But if
right.
it's not too challenging, you become bored, which again is
Yes.
another way of saying you're thinking about yourself again.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So I would say, I wouldn't say that makes it difficult to get into flow, but again, with the whole idea of trying something new, it's like cooking, for example, right? You're not going to know if you enjoy cooking unless you try, and you're not going to be great at it the first time. But it's something that affords you the opportunity to discover whether this is something that can provide you with that flow state. So I wouldn't say it's difficult or hard to get into flow, but you just have to be willing and open to try something.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
try something, you know?
Having that, yeah, that willingness to try something. So, are there things that come naturally to us, Hailee, or is it really an existentialist's
Ooh,
approach to just trying everything and figuring it out?
that's such a good question, and I wonder that myself. Because I consider myself an idealist. I believe everything is possible, right?
Mm,
And this idea of being born with gifts or talents or particular abilities, sometimes we can trace them back to genetics, right? Like, okay, my mom was good at this, I'm good at this. But is there something that, kind of separates us or sets us apart in terms of gifts and talents? Perhaps, I would say. But if I'm honest, my perspective, and I know there are a lot of, perspectives that disagree with this, but I genuinely believe you can do anything you want to do if you really want to do it, right? It might be harder for you because of your circumstances, your genetics, your education level, whatever the case might be, but that doesn't take away. We see it every day.
mm,
We see it every day. People coming from nothing ended up doing the most amazing things. People whose circumstances dictate that they shouldn't, but yet, they're out there doing it. So I do believe, yes, that because of circumstances, you will probably be better at something than I am, but that won't stop me from being as good or better than you if it's something I
Yeah.
really want.
Yeah. Yeah. Which to me, that takes me to that chicken or the egg dilemma again, right? Because then I start thinking, so Haley's become way better than me at this certain thing because she had this belief that
Yeah,
it was just it had to be that way, and then I'm
yeah.
thinking, where did that belief come from?
Right. Well, and we go deeper, right? This fascinates me, Tom, right? Because even in my own group of friends, I feel like the confidence we have in and the belief that we have in ourselves in different spaces is just different,
Mm,
right? And where do we get our beliefs from? It's such an intriguing question. Why is it that I believe I can do anything where someone else will say, well, I believe I can do great, but in this area.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not gonna, I don't think that's for me. I'm not even gonna try. I don't think I can do it. I Is it circumstance? I don't know. Is it Sometimes I wonder, Tom, if it's a choice.
Mm,
If you can just choose to believe. I'd like to think that.
yeah.
I'd like to think that you can decide if you want to believe or not. Because believing sometimes is scary. It's easier to just say, no, I can't do that.
Fuck
Yeah.
that.
So I mean, maybe it's a choice. I don't have a definitive answer for that. It fascinates me too, but I'd like to think maybe it's a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so hard. It's like, I
Yeah,
mean, we're really talking about determinism and free will now, which is,
right.
I mean, no one's been able to figure that out. I
Yeah.
think that I like Mark Manson's idea of, not necessarily free will and determinism, but this notion of figuring out what your purpose is, right? Where most people, and I mean, how often does that come up in our work, right? What is my purpose? What is my
Yes.
identity?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yes.
Great question to come to because it means you are now thinking more consciously. There's this idea that I don't have to be this certain way. So it's a terrifying question because we presume that you don't have a sense of self, but then
Yes.
we also presume that who you thought you were can no longer be, which is in itself very opportunistic. So
Mm,
it's a good place to be. But
yeah.
one of the things that Mark Manson says is you want to pay it. He says, "What's your favorite flavor of shit sandwich?" Right? I love that so much. What he means is, what 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 thing do you hate to do the least in comparison to other people? So it's the inverse of what do you want to do the most? When people say,
Mm,
"What's your purpose?" That it sounds so wonderful. You get this cozy purpose, and then just in flow state for the rest of your life, and everything's
yeah.
wonderful. But he's saying there's always going to be shit involved in life. What kind of shit do you mind? Do you hate eating the least? In a sense. For him, and I was very aligned with this. I love to write as well. His idea was people would come up to me all the time and they would say, "Mark, I love your blog, man. It's amazing. I read every one that comes out. How the hell can you write so much? And why is your writing so coherent and so concise?" And his common response before he started studying, I suppose, flow and philosophy and so on, was he just thought that everyone could do it, but he just seemed to do it more. Or he's like, why can't everyone do this, right? So you sort of start to recognize what your talents are,
Yeah.
not because you have the discipline to do them, but you're starting to see that other people don't seem to be able to do them as easily as you.
Yes. Yes. And as well as you do, right? Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. And I I think it's also something that's beautifully human is recognizing, oh, actually, this is something that comes a little easier to me than
Mm,
other people, and recognizing that in other people, seeing because I think one of the privileges I think of being a coach and also a professor is seeing things in people that they don't yet see in themselves
yes,
and
yes.
calling it out and watching their face like start to realize, oh wow, there might be something here. I
Yeah.
think I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think we are created in such a way that we do that for each other, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like that, and I'm inclined to agree to an extent, but I also find it fascinating. You know the story of, which one is it? The one that discovered gravity, the apple on the head, and
Oh, yeah,
like,
Isaac Newton.
yes, I like that story so much because this guy was already uh, like, who else for the apple to fall on the head,
That's such
right?
a good point. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, we look at that and it just seems like, oh yeah, an apple randomly fell on his head, but he was already in that thinking space for that apple to be more meaningful to him than if it fell on my head. I wouldn't have
I
discovered anything.
just eat it.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I'm also, it's just so interesting how random experiences as well can be not so random depending on just who they happen to. The same thing can happen to you and I, Tom, but we turn it into different things, you know.
Yes.
So circumstances, I there's just so much here. Is it the circumstance? Is it the person? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's probably both, really, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
it's usually the case. It's
yeah,
that gray area,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
A
you know,
bit of both.
yeah, like the apple fell on Isaac Newton's head. I think, as the story goes, he was reading under a tree or something like that,
Yeah,
you know, but for whatever reason, he picked it up and gone, why does an apple fall? Like, we
yeah,
all just think that that's normal, so we don't think about it, you know, but it seems to be the case that everything starts here and goes there. Why
yes,
does it do that?
yes,
You know, be
yeah,
curious, I suppose.
yes, and asking questions. And as we're talking about identity as well, curiosity is bravery, you know. And I think in these spaces where we're talking about identity and all of this, it's the freedom to be curious, to see, who would I be in this space? Who would I be if I tried lifting heavier? Who would I be if I tried cooking? Who would I be? You know, just allowing yourself opportunity to discover, you know, in different spaces, because who knows what you're going to bring to that space,
Exactly.
you know?
Exactly. Yeah. It's so true, isn't it?
Hmm.
Curiosity, it is, you do have to be courageous to be curious, because
You,
to be curious, I've always thought, I actually really loved your thoughts on this one, Haley, but I've always thought about why people aren't curious when they're having conversations with people they disagree with. And
yeah,
I think it's because for me to move away from defending my position to being curious, I have to see you with enough worth, intrinsic worth, at least in as much as I see myself, which therefore means that I have to think that you're not completely insane. There could be some
yes,
validity to what you're saying.
yes, yes, and yes. And that that is also something that fascinates me too, because what is it, you know, when I talk about intergroup conflict, this comes up a lot, because it's like, what is it that can allow a person to be brave enough to hang their thoughts and beliefs on a shelf and say, all right, let me hear what
Mhm.
this is about. Let me hear your, let me try to understand your experience and why you think the way that you do, right? I see this when I look at politics in every country that I've lived in. You have generational politics, right?
Mhm.
Like, people are member of parties because their parents were and their grandparents were, and they just wear that identity because, well, this is what we are.
Yeah.
But if you were curious enough to ask, not just ask about the others, but ask about your own. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? Do I even believe this? Is this even who I want to be? You know, and it does take bravery, especially, you know, I talk a lot and work a lot with generational cycles. And to be the first person in your family line to ask a question is scary,
Yeah.
or to break a cycle is scary, right? So I have to acknowledge the fear that comes with it. It's not easy, but
Mm,
so rewarding.
mm. I mean, you would have a very interesting perspective on that because you've lived in so many different. How many countries have you lived in, Hailee?
Um, Three. Official, is it three? Yes. I've lived in uh, Canada, Jamaica, and England, and different cities in each.
Mm,
But it's interesting because after living in so many places, I find it easier to not get bogged down into any kind of like identity, if you want to call it that.
yes, which
Right.
I imagine is also comes with its own sort of existential isolation as well. Like I've spoken to a lot of
Yes.
expats and immigrants, and my partner, for example, Siobhan, grew up until she was about 19 in the Scottish Highlands.
Hmm.
But she's been in Australia now for nearly as long as she grew up there. So she doesn't really feel either Australian
Yeah.
or Scottish, which
Yes.
is freeing, but also
Yeah.
kind of sad.
Isolating.
Yeah,
Yes.
isolating.
Yeah. Yeah. And I understand that feeling. Sometimes it does feel a little, I don't know if lonely is the word, but it's like I can't genuinely take on some of the, let's call it identities that people get excited about. It's just, I just can't.
Hmm.
Not because I'm so used to them shifting all
Right.
the time. And it's also interesting when you live in one country and then you move to another and you see the perspective that this country has on that country.
Mm.
And it's like, you're so off, right? And that also causes me to appreciate curiosity even more, because I'm realizing how easy it is to cast judgment, or, as humans, we do that to kind of make our way through the world. We categorize,
Yep.
but to make those categories stationary and permanent,
Mm.
so problematic. And you
Brilliant.
miss out so much on just learning, you
Right.
know.
Right.
Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah. Judgment helps, right? Because it gives us a stable sense of self. Because
Yes, yes,
my ego only knows itself by the relative position of yours. So if I say
yes,
this is you, well then okay, now I feel better because now I
yes,
know who I am because of the
yes,
opposite of that.
yes.
And it's good because it gives me a stable sense of self, but then it's also bad because it means now it's harder for me to let go of that sense of self if new information comes along that is more valid, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the questions I am currently asking, I don't have the answer to it right yet, is what are the stable, permanent elements of identity? What are the permanent, stable parts that, and I don't have the answer.
Yes.
But it's something that I'm contemplating. Should there be permanent parts? Is it necessary? Are there
Mm,
things that make me, very, what's the word? Very like set in stone. This is Hailee. What are those parts of me? And are they malleable? Are they like, or are there parts that just will not move? I don't know.
yes. So if we applied deductive reasoning to this, we
Yeah.
would. So let's. I wonder if we could get somewhere with it. So there are aspects of identity that usually sit on the periphery, and they are influenced by different social dynamics. Like we're all a
Yes.
bit of a chameleon, right?
Yeah.
But then the further you go in, um, there are some aspects of being Hailee and aspects of being Tom that kind of don't change. And this is where it almost gets spiritual, right? I love Ram Dass, who believes that the only thing that doesn't change is awareness itself. Like I know that I might speak to you differently in comparison to another guest, in comparison to my dad or a client or whatever it is. But I always bring with myself the fact that I'm aware that I'm having an experience right now.
Mm.
And is it really the case then that after that awareness, everything else about me is malleable because that's terrifying.
I know. I know that's what that is that is the part that I don't know,
Mm,
and I'm wondering if you know, is it just that human nature itself is just fickle and movable, malleable, all of these things, from some religious Christian perspectives, even.
mm,
There's the idea that the one thing that is stable is God,
mhm.
right? And your connectivity, your connection to God is what keeps you grounded
Yes,
because we are, as human beings, we we are just kind of all over the place, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing, but it's one perspective to what is a part of our existence that is unmoving.
exactly. The unmoving aspect, and that's what I
Yeah,
think awareness is to some. Like maybe this is too much of a secular viewpoint on religion and God, but I I feel like if if you deeply meditated experience, or when you're lost in the flow state,
yeah.
or when you're on a psychedelic, whatever it is, when you have this total loss of self, and it like if I'm identifying as awareness, then there's no other part of me that exists apart from the fact that I'm having an experience, which means that you and I are the same person. Josh, our friend and colleague, has Varmasi on his shoulder, thou art that, right? This
Mm,
idea that when you really get down to the bottom of it, it is all one. And that oneness, even though talking about it immediately separates it, but when you're there, that is God. That is being with God, right?
hmm. This idea of like the oneness of all of us. Is that it? The
I think so. I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah, it's not a religion. It's more of a Gnostic
Okay.
interpretation of God as
Yeah.
opposed to God being a sort of a being, in other words.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me just thinking about permanence because I feel like life itself is so fleeting. So to try to find permanence in my identity on this fleeting earth, is it possible? I don't know. Is there something
Yeah,
there? There are some arguments, right, that we are eternal beings, right? And we're just here on earth for a time. And, a lot of people, a lot of religions, perspectives try to tap into that eternal part to answer the questions of the temporary part.
right.
But, I think the fun part is that there's endless questions
Totally,
and
totally.
we get to keep trying to figure it out.
Exactly, which is the flow state, right? Like, the more conversations we have, like, the joy of just continually talking about it together.
Yes, and being curious and asking and putting yourself in uncomfortable places and spaces. Absolutely.
Yeah, beautiful,
Yeah.
and for everyone listening, so Haley and I said that before the show, we would have no idea what we would talk about. It was completely candid and unscripted, and we got to how to find your purpose, the nature of consciousness, and the flow state, so we did pretty well.
I think we answered a lot of really important questions today, Tom.
Exactly, exactly. Amazing,
Fantastic.
Haley. We got to do this again. This was so fun.
Absolutely. I had a blast. Loved, and PhD students don't often get the opportunity to talk about their research. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about flow and intergroup conflict and all of these things that I am very interested in.
Definitely, definitely. So helpful and so pertinent to the current climate, I know
Absolutely.
you and I do relationship work, but that's a microcosm of what's going on in the world. So,
Exactly. It's a mirror image of the bigger picture,
right.
100%. So, yeah.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Your just very quickly, your PhD is online, right? So people can access it to have a read,
Yes,
or
it is. If you just type in Hailee Ingleton PhD, you'll see it. It will come up and you can have a read.
beautiful, beautiful. And are there any other places that people can access your work, Haley, or any links that people should know about?
At the moment, I you can. LinkedIn is probably the best place just to see. I try to update it regularly with the things that I'm currently doing. So that would probably be the best place to see all the other stuff I'm involved in.
Beautiful, beautiful. Hailee Ingleton on LinkedIn.
That's right.
Awesome, awesome. We're
Yes,
definitely going to do this again, Hailee. Thank you so much once more.
absolutely. Thank you, Tom. This was great.